this was a really interesting thing. Let me take a drink of water before I read it. This is Kadashiro Harada, which is the sort of chief game director for Tekken. Yeah, he's a big part of the Tekken franchise, loved by the community, is often involved in it. I mean, this is a really interesting read. I'm going to read it to you, but let me get a drink first. Because the people recently, just sort of the backdrop to this, recently Ninja Gaiden 2 came out. Black, the sort of like remake of it, or remaster, whatever you want to call it, of Ninja Gaiden 2. And the announcement of Ninja Gaiden 4. So Itagaki, which is a guy that made Ninja Gaiden 2 and was left Temco, very kind of like public breakup, not on good terms. But people have sort of been talking about Itagaki again, and some of the stuff that came out about, he was also the guy that made Dead Alive as well as Ninja Gaiden, and he kind of evidenced that when he was friends with Itagaki and DOA, that literally had this printed in no particular order. So this is Itagaki's hit list, top 5 most hated games in no particular order. And it's Tekken, Tekken 2, Tekken 3, Tekken 4, Tekken 5. I can no longer figure out what the hell they're trying to do with the numbering. I don't know which one is which. I don't know what they're trying to do with all of the spin-offs. So this includes Nina, Death by Degrees as well. I don't think it's even needs saying, but people should stay away from Tekken. Nothing left to say. Just don't want them to disappoint me anymore. It's so annoying. Please don't annoy me anymore. So this is Itagaki, the sort of like maker of Tekken and DOA franchise. So this is him sort of talking about his history. It's a little bit long, but I'm going to read it because I think it's very fascinating. I'm not sure how you perceive my relationship with Mr. Itagaki, but I can tell you it's likely different from what you imagine. Let me provide a general overview with some key topics regarding my history with Mr. Itagaki. However, consider this a warning. What follows is content that would normally be covered in media articles interview. I strongly advise any impatient fighting game fans out there to stop reading it. No scratches is a serious warning. If you have a typical level of patience and common sense, you better not reading further. There's a hard chance that you'll fall asleep midway. Even though I admitted most of the events focus on major incidents, let me be clear, I warned you ahead of time. This is obviously, he's just warning that it's a lot to read. Now, what I'm about to discuss happened during the old Namco era, and it has almost nothing to do with the post-merger Bandai Namco era. So younger generation employees who joined after the Bandai merger, consider yourself exempt from this content. Also, forgive my translation errors or nuances I might have misinterpreted. I'm still stuck at English level of my university days. Yes, I've warned you about everything. You should not read further. You'll regret if you do. So at first contact, it was during the 1990s. The first Dead Alive was announced. On the way back from the game show, I happened to run into Sega's Virtual Fighter team, who would later become the heads of Sega AM2. At Station, coincidentally, Mr. Itagaki also appeared, and the key people behind VF, Tekken, and DOA were all there by chance, so we decided to take advantage of this opportunity and went out for drinks at the Izukaya in Shinjuku. At the Izakaya, I and 2 members of Sony AM team got into an animated discussion about shared technical topics. At the time, Namco shared some animation control techniques with Sega through engineers we had headhunted from Sega. Of course, just a few years later, the Tekken project independently developed its own animation control technology from scratch. The knowledge and foundational technology developed by the Tekken project at the time would become the very origins of Bandai Namco's human action development technology today. Surprisingly, many Bandai Namco employees were unaware of this fact. Tekken is the ancestor of Bandai Namco's polygon-era animation and action control technologies. Without this foundation, it's self-evident we wouldn't have been able to co-develop Smash Brothers with Mr. Sakurai. Wow, that's... So Tekken has kind of gave root to Smash Bros, which is kind of interesting. Mr. Itagaki listened with great interest as I and the Sega executive discussed these topics. Later, we all bonded over casual, non-work related chatter about games. One moment stands out even after nearly 30 years. Mr. Itagaki said to me, "Mr. Harada, you're a really approachable and funny person." At the time, Mr. Itagaki still addressed me using polite language, and of course, I did the same for him. In other words, we don't know much about each other yet, and our relationship was very professional and gentlemanly at the time. And this is number 2, what Itagaki discovered. A few months later, the VF Tekken and DOA drinking session, I happened to run into Mr. Itagaki at another gaming event. He approached me and said, "Harada, you're from Waseda University, aren't you? I also went to Waseda, and our time there overlapped. That makes you my junior." I responded, "I might be your junior, but I don't think we were there at the same time." However, he said, "No, I was so busy with Mahjong every day that it took me 7 years to graduate." I'm sure 7 years of graduate. Sheesh. I'm sure we were there at the same time. In fact, I remember seeing you during our university days. You were the captain of the yacht racing team, weren't you? Yes, Mr. Itagaki had thoroughly researched my background and discovered that I was his junior. From now on, then, he started referring to me as his junior and speaking to me in a casual tone of a senior addressing a junior, dropping the polite language entirely. So he started researching up on Harada. The beginning of Itagaki's media strategy. Mr. Itagaki wasn't just a game designer or director. More than anything, he was starting to show his prowess as a producer. So this is when they start, kind of the rivalry starts. This became clear after he left Temco, and he explicitly told me as much. Back then, he began to seriously think about how to elevate DOA to surpass Tekken in terms of marketing and branding. Let's rewind a bit to the past. During that time, the arcade, and this is a really interesting history about the kind of like arcade gaming and how it transitioned. During this time, arcade gaming market was still thriving. Sega and Namco were both giants dominating the Japanese arcade market. Not only did they develop games, but they also operated their own arcade chains, domestically and internationally, managing a significant share of gaming distribution and publishing as well. Mr. Itagaki recognized that Temco couldn't compete against this level of marketing and publishing power. As a result, he explored media strategies not using only print magazines, but also the emerging internet media of the time. Despite his outwardly emotional demeanor, Mr. Itagaki had a very cool and calculating eye for analyzing resources and strategy. Among his various techniques, one of them was to deliberately bite at Tekken to draw media attention. In doing so, he even called me out by name and criticized Tekken games' design and other aspects. Let me emphasize, this was just one of the many strategies he employed, not his only approach. So this is kind of going down to this. Yeah, this is like Itagaki talking about Tekken. What games he hates the most? Tekken 1, 2 through 5. So, going back to this. 5. The Sudden Summons Incident. So this is back to 1998. Out of the blue, Itagaki called Namco directly and asked me by name. As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Itagaki had started his media strategy of targeting Tekken and learned that I was his junior from university. Given the strained relationship I had with him at the time, his call left me deeply confused. Cautiously, I picked up the phone and he said, "This is kind of where it's interesting. Could you come to Tekko's headquarters, just you alone?" This reminded me of getting summoned by a delinquent upperclassman to the school building back in middle school. For a moment, I considered declining, but in the end, my curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed to his request and headed to Namco headquarters the following day. Temco headquarters. When I arrived, Mr. Itagaki greeted me and led me to a small room. There I saw something covered with a cloth that looked like an arcade cabinet. Like a magician performing a stage act, he dramatically removed the color cover with a flourish. Underneath was an arcade cabinet and CTR monitor, revealing something for the first time, the development build of DOA 2, which had not been announced. It would debut in arcades a year later, in the fall of 1999. "You're the first outsider to see this screen," he said. More than the game itself, I was bewildered by his magician-like presentation. That aside, he had two main purposes for summoning me. First, he wanted to sell more DOA boards to the arcade market. At the time, Sega and Namco were the two largest buyers of arcade boards due to their extensive arcade chains. Normally, he would have approached Namco's sales team, but he felt that wasn't enough. Instead, he sought validation from a developer like me, hoping my endorsement would lead to Namco's purchasing more DOA boards. Secondly, he wanted to gauge DOA's performance, seeing how the Tekken project would react. If I so much as scoffed as DOA 2, he would take this as evidence that Tekken had superior technology and confidence. On the other hand, if I showed signs of being impressed or unsettled, he would use this as a benchmark to compare Tease Ninja's position to the Tekken project. So he wants to invited the head of Tekken to sort of gauge how he would react to see if, he kind of saw them as their main competition. After presenting the content briefly, he said, "All right, give it a try." When I pressed the start button, he sat down right next to me as we were about to face off. I chose Kazumi under his unspoken pressure and began playing. Just seconds into the match, after pressing the punch button 3 times, he asked, "Well, what do you think?" I was completely thrown off. How could I possibly judge after only a few seconds? I instinctively replied, "It feels good to play." I expected him to retort, "How could you know just after a few seconds?" Instead, he responded with, "See, I told you, Harada." At the moment, I was genuinely confused. Was he serious? Was this some kind of hidden camera prank? To be fair, DOA had already demonstrated impressive technical achievement for its time, even in its unfinished state. However, his insistence on immediately feedback and constant explanations while I played left me overwhelmed with information. Later, I learned from a former Team Ninja member that after my visit, Itagaki returned to the development floor and declared, "Today we beat Tekken." While I was merely startled by his approach, he took it as proof that I was overwhelmed by DOA 2's performance. There's a lot of rivalry going on behind the scenes of this sort of arcade market. This is number 6, Itagaki's analysis and strategy. Later, Mr. Itagaki explained to me that he felt a significant sense of accomplishment from his media strategy at the time. His aggressive stance against rival titles clearly led to a significant increase in readership, especially in Western gaming media. He told me that this approach, while unpopular in Japan, where comparative advertising was frowned upon, was highly effective overseas. I guess Americans, we like a rivalry. We like to see guys going head to head. Additionally, Itagaki was known by some for his vast knowledge of global history and military affairs, particularly World War II. He likened the relationship between DOA and Tekken to warfare. He believed that winning in war would require reconnaissance of the enemy's resources, so he conducted detailed analysis of Tekken project's capabilities. In his personal office, he even displayed a chart analyzing Namco's Tekken project's team's strength. This is kind of crazy, he began with the game staff credits, particularly investigating the educational backgrounds, careers, skills, and achievements of individuals listed. This is how he discovered and mentioned earlier that I was a junior at Waseda University. He also analyzed the order in which names appeared to the credits, finding patterns like this. Those listed at the top of each unit were not necessarily core technical contributors. Instead, they were likely managers skilled in people management or senior staff moving away from hands-on work. According to Itagaki, my presence as a young team leader at the time didn't align with these patterns, which made me stand out as an unusual figure to keep tabs on. So he's doing really thorough research into Tekken. He was correct in this assessment. At the time, I was privileged to work with brilliant individuals, some 10 years my senior, including directors and programmers regarded as geniuses. These senior colleagues provided me with exceptional support, allowing me to lead game design in an environment where I was, in a sense, spoiled. They often asked, "Harada, what do you want to do? What do you need? We'll provide anything." It was an extraordinary setup that made me something of an anomaly in the industry. When our rivalry ended, Mr. Itagaki showed me his analysis charts during a later conversation. I was astonished by its accuracy. It identified key figures in the Tekken project who were instrumental at the time. Seeing it left me with an eerie feeling. So he's being stalked. Itagaki the stalker. During the late 90s and 2000s, when the gaming industry had yet to establish sophisticated marketing analysis, Itagaki had detailed understanding of Tekken's sales figures, customer demographics. Using this data, he developed strategies to elevate DOA's brand recognition by directly opposing Tekken in the media. At the same time, his product development strategy avoided head-on collisions with Tekken. Instead, he identified needs that Tekken didn't fulfill and areas where DOA could excel technically, crafting a distinct direction for his game. This sounds pretty brilliant. This is why DOA ultimately offered gameplay and targeted a market audience different from Tekken's. So Itagaki doing some really high-level stuff to help his game succeed. Number 7, After the War. After Itagaki left Capcom in 2008, he called me again. At the time, our dynamic hadn't changed much from the previous 10 years. I still perceived our relationship as adversarial. Yet there he was calling me once again. He invited me to dinner where he shared he had left Temco. During the meal, he said something surprising. Harada, you are my comrade in arms. I realized then that this was how he saw our relationship. He explained his strategies and thoughts for the time in detail, stating explicitly, I never had a grudge against you, Namco or Tekken. On the contrary, I respected you all. When I compared the power dynamics in development, sales, and publishing, it was clear that a straightforward approach wouldn't work. I had to employ every strategy I could. I'm sorry for everything. Then he turned the tables and asked about Tekken strategies, particularly in terms of production, branding, and marketing. I explained many things, but emphasized this. Since the 1990s, I've been visiting arcade venues worldwide to see how players would engage with my games. I also, and this is actually really interesting how he kind of saw the future. I also met with numerous arcade operators and distributors. Around the late 90s, I quickly noticed the rapid decline of arcade markets in the West. Arcades were shutting down at an alarming rate. This signaled that the battleground for fighting games was shifting from arcades to home consoles. More importantly, the value of one play for 100 yen, or 25 cents in the US, was disappearing. The incentives for the winning player to keep playing on a single coin was fading, as was the risk of losing coins for the losing player. This fundamentally changed the value perception of fighting games as a form of entertainment, which is kind of wild to think about. A lot of game design back in the day was around, getting players to spend coins, spend money in the arcades. Realizing this, we shifted Tekken's strategy towards establishing fighting games as a viable product for home console. As many know, Tekken was ahead of its time in the genre, having developed and released modes like Tekken Ball, which came before DOA Beach Volleyball, belt action modes such as Tekken Force, and pre-rendered movies and story campaign modes that went beyond the typical scope of fighting games. Which, story modes aren't necessarily, great for the arcades, but for a home console, that's, definitely a big value for people just wanting to play by themselves. In addition to this, I explained how I became aware of the emergence of community events in North America as arcades began to decline. At the time, these events were at grassroots level. They ranged from small gathering at someone's house to tournaments held in university halls or community centers. Over time, they grew into larger tournaments hosted in hotel ballrooms and gymnasiums. This is sort of start of the esports scene. I recognized the potential of these events early on and began providing behind-the-scenes support to these communities. Specifically, we offered free rental of arcade cabinets and game boards, took care of transportation setup, and occasionally provided small prizes like posters for tournament winners. In fact, many veteran players in their 40s and 50s today may not have known my name or who I was back then, but might remember seeing me quietly setting up arcade machines at venues without even wearing sunglasses back then. So he was one of the first people to sort of catch on to the emergence of the fighting game community in the esports scene. During this time, Street Fighter had gone into a decade-long hibernation following Street Fighter 3, and the decline of arcades accelerated as the game markets shifted. Even as the other fighting game series disappeared, I focused on maintaining both the active home console market and the footholds in the Asian arcade market. In fact, the method of constantly releasing new games in the series without a break and using the huge profits made from arcade boards and in-game purchases to fund development of console versions was surprisingly able to continue all the way up to Tekken 7. This including supporting grassroots tournaments and community, the FGC, or fighting game community as known, to keep our business and development ongoing. So he did like a combination approach of arcades and in-game purchases with consoles. At the time, I can confidently say that very few developers were paying attention to the growing tournament scene in the West. How do I know this? Because during those years, I was often the only Japanese developer on site, personally dealing cabinets or boards or observing events. While marketing representatives from various companies were present, I rarely saw other developers engaging directly with these communities. This approach allowed Tekken to continue its unnumbered releases steadily, even through the winter of the arcade market. While the Virtual Fighter series fell silent, we expanded into the Western market and secured a significant share. I believe that when I faced my own hardships, no one would come to my aid, but the support from an external entity, namely the core fighting game community in the market, would be the only thing I could rely on. I told Mr. Itagaki that I kept this strategy under wraps, either sharing it with the other teams in the company or discussing it with developers from other companies. I simply worked on it quietly. Upon hearing this, he was surprised and said, "What? That's not what a developer is supposed to do. Really, you're more action-oriented than I expected." It seemed that he had a stereotypical image of game developers born in the 1970s as people who stayed in their office, glued to their monitor, endlessly coding. To be fair, that was also part of my work, but by the late 90s, I was using the development downtime between projects to travel around the world. And to finish up, pointing into the confident, through this extended past strategy has resolved my long-standing feud with Mr. Itagaki. This happened in the late 2008s. After that, every year I'd received a drunken phone call from him, which had become something of a tradition. That said, I haven't received one in the last few years, come to think of it. And that's the end of this thread. So it's really cool to see this sort of rivalry between these people. Well, it's, I guess, almost kind of one-sided, but the sort of different strategies these two franchises took, with Tekken kind of focusing on the home console and the kind of growing community market that kind of came with the consoles, and Itagaki and DOA kind of focusing on the sort of rivalry to kind of up their own brand and get media attention to DOA and kind of position it as an alternative to Tekken, both being sort of the 3D fighters. But of course, DOA ultimately kind of focused more on the sort of beach volleyball aspect of it. I think that ended up being a bigger seller, as of course it translates much better to home consoles, as it's like a single player game. And of course, with the sort of ladies, you can sell a shit ton of DLC. Like here's a string bikini for $5 or whatever. So it's interesting how both the fighting games go. And I don't know if DOA is going to get sort of revived. It kind of fell off. I don't know when the last DOA was released. Let me kind of Google that. Last DOA released was back in 2019. Wow. Oh wait, was that when DOA was released? No, I think it was the last one. DOA 6. So it's been a while. And of course, Itagaki has left Temco, so who knows what's going on, but this was sort of like spurred because of the recent resurgence of Ninja Gaiden, Of course, Itagaki is kind of famous for working on that. And a lot of like kind of purists from Ninja Gaiden 2, Itagaki has a lot of hardcore fans that kind of consider the games made after his release, not as good as Ninja Gaiden 2. For some reason, they call him like jihadist too, like Itagaki's jihadist type of thing. As sort of like the community is divided, the Ninja Gaiden community is divided since that schism between the two. But it's really cool to see this sort of thread that Harada put out, and the sort of history, and an interesting history between the two franchises and the shift in the market.